Well, hey, folks, we're going to try something new this time. In teacher parlance, it's called flipping the classroom, but what it really amounts to is you listen and take notes to and think about the information going to be discussed here, and then come into class with some questions to ask, with some notes taken, and at least a couple of questions for the class. They can be factually based, they can be bigger ideas that came up, or things more that you wanted to know. And we talk about them in class and see if we can digest the stuff this way. What we're moving into here is the so-called rise of the West. It's a contested topic, but one thing is pretty clear. Up until the time period we've looked at this far, up until about the 15th century, look, the world really was about Asia. It was about China. It was about the Muslim empires. Europe itself had been fairly far behind. There were no major European kingdoms really until going all the way back until the time period of the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans. All begins to change. As you probably know, by the 19th century, Europe is pretty dominant across the world. The United States is kind of an extension of Europe, sort of takes over the mantle afterwards. And for better or worse, and it's some of both to be sure, it remains still a Western-dominated world today. Although whether that's true a century from now, it's hard to know. So we're going to take a look at the intellectual reasons behind that change. What is it? Thinking changed within Europe, which led to other more material changes. And that's what we'll take a look at. Again, you will want to be taking notes on this. I will ask to take a look at them the day that we're in class, and also come in with at least 2 questions that you're ready to ask the class, to ask me to further discussion here. First of all, jumping ahead of ourselves a little bit, from roughly 1400 to 1800, Europe changed dramatically. And you see all the reasons appearing before you. The Renaissance, which you know mainly as an artistic movement, but also involved new ways of thinking, asking questions, just simply trying new things. The idea that human beings mattered, that individuals mattered, that perhaps all the answers don't come from a blind belief in God, and let's stop there. The Reformation will look at more the split of the Western Christian church between Catholic and Protestant. The printing press will discuss the fact that information could get spread from place to place relatively quickly. The Age of Exploration we've already looked at. The scientific revolution we'll touch on toward the end. Tied into all of this is gunpowder, modern armies. The idea of the Enlightenment we'll look at us in a separate section, but the idea of taking, well, the scientific ideas. If Copernicus and Galileo could understand the physical laws of the universe, well, can we do the same thing with human societies? Nation states going from small little kingdoms and city-states to big, powerful modern countries. Parliamentary republics, you don't see this everywhere, but you see the birth of the idea of what we call democracies. Early capitalism, that an economic system based on individual wealth and growth and profit. The early industrial revolution, it doesn't have a huge impact in most parts of the world by 1800, but really this is the big change that's coming in the period after. And the French Revolution, which we'll deal with in the next unit, actually the Industrial Revolution as well. But an idea that by 1800, Europe is a pretty different place. The big changes that we're seeing, Western Christendom, by the way, that certainly relates to the idea of individual nation states. Religion becomes sort of a tool of power in the hands of individual kings. The scientific revolution, well, we could go into a long discussion here about the fact that since people are questioning the very nature of things, did this come out of having already questioned the dominance of the church? A rise of a proto-capitalism. Now, proto means beginning. But once again, if the way things had always worked in terms of the church says this and we don't ask any questions, if we're starting to question that, maybe the economic order can also be questioned. And again, the Enlightenment, which we won't get to here, all of these things lead to a new way of thinking about human beings and human society. Just taking a look at this map of Europe, and I'm going to ask you for a second to stop the film and ask yourself what appears to be different from today's Europe. Now, one of the things, no doubt, that you are seeing is that there are empires that were there, the Ottoman Empire, the Austrian Habsburg Empire. They're not there anymore today. Obviously, you're seeing some major changes in what was Russia. Lithuania is nowhere near this size. You are seeing a France, you are seeing a Spain, you are seeing an England. What you are not seeing by any means is a Germany or an Italy, and that should be pretty obvious by this point. This area that I'm circling now is known as the Holy Roman Empire. It is not an empire in terms of actual control. Really what you have is a lot of people speaking, not entirely, but largely Germanic languages, nominally, in theory, in name only, under the head of a ruling family that in theory had the approval of the church to rule over it. But it's a very different Europe that will start to appear by the mid-1800s, or appear by the mid-1800s. You're not going to need to know the details of this at all, but one of the things that you know that royal families across the world have done is intermarried. The marriage that you may already know about is that Ferdinand of, I believe, Aragon and Isabel of Castile, although perhaps I have those two backwards, they get married in 1469. Doesn't necessarily mean exactly a country called Spain, but you have the huge resources of these two major Spanish kingdoms coming together. You'll notice also that in the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburg family marries into another family which unifies Austria, Burgundy, which is a part of France, and the Netherlands. You see that the daughter, Johanna, Ferdinand Isabella, marries Philip, the Habsburg son. You are now seeing the Spanish kingdom and the Habsburg family together. Charles I is the son of Johanna and Philip. He inherits Spain and the Spanish Netherlands, which is a part of Spain, in 1516 when his father dies. He is then elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1519. Charles, by the way, has two names. He is the first Charles, the first Carlos of Spain, but he is the fifth Charles of the Holy Roman Empire. So you can call him Charles I of Spain or Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. What this basically amounts to is one family owning a tremendous amount of territory, and even more, as you'll see in a moment. Incidentally, this little bloodline that you're seeing down leads to this unfortunate fellow at the bottom and the end of the Spanish Habsburgs. You may notice that Charles II at the bottom seems to be, well, honestly, doesn't look quite right. And he wasn't, because there was so much intermarriage, so many uncles and nieces and first cousins and close relatives that you had damaging recessive genes that were being passed on in the family. By the time Charles II takes over in 1661, he is severely mentally impaired. He is physically impaired. He apparently had a tongue so large that he could barely close his mouth. He couldn't speak, he couldn't dress himself, but by God, he is our king. One other thing, he's also sterile, meaning there will be no heir, there will be no next generation, and that creates a pretty major problem. In fact, leads to a first of numerous 18th century European wars. Again, we've seen this, I think, the other day in class, but the empire of Charles V, notice a very young man at the time, not only Spain, which of course is the wealthiest kingdom in all of Europe because of the exploration, but also he is the nominal head of the Holy Roman Empire, in particular the Netherlands, which are under direct Spanish control, and of course the wealth of the Spanish held areas in the New World. Also the Philippines, I suppose we could throw in here, although I think that is not technically under direct Spanish control until a little after his death. I don't know if that's going to work. I didn't want to go back like that. I'd like you for a second to not turn to a neighbor unless you're watching this with somebody, but to stop for a second and think, why might the Catholic Church have becoming less powerful by the 15th century? Now notice, I do not mean powerless. There's a tendency to all or nothing it, to say, well, the Catholic Church had no power. The Catholic Church was incredibly powerful by the 15th century, but significantly less so. Can you think of any of the things that had happened that we've covered, that you've read about in the previous 2 or 3 centuries? We're seeing a nice little list here. Recall that the Crusades were ultimately not very effective. Yes, for a short period, the Holy Lands were taken, but for all the expenditure and for all the power the church showed, ultimately by the 13th century when they ended, well, they just didn't work. They've remained largely, the Holy Lands remained almost entirely in Muslim hands. Secondly, in order to bankroll this and to make this happen, in order to have hotels set up or inns for these armies to stay in, to have people loaning money to keep the armies going, to have craftsmen who can repair the swords and repair the weapons and provide food. What you start seeing throughout Europe is an urbanized class, a merchant class, a banker class, people living in the cities. This tends to mean people having different motivations. It's not necessarily all about serving God. It could be about serving my own economic interests. You tend to see a rise of universities, of education. All of these are very Christian institutions at first, but start to become a little bit less specifically Christian. And the idea of nationalism, in theory, all the Crusaders were fighting for the church, fighting for Jesus, fighting for the Christian faith, but it also makes sense if local lords, local small-scale kings or princes are raising armies for this, they begin to see themselves as, well, we are French-speaking people, we are Spanish-speaking, we are German-speaking people, the beginnings of nationalism. And throughout Europe today, as you know, people consider themselves, for the most part, to be Italian first, or to be Swedish first, or to be English first, as opposed to a Christian first. The vernacular is a wonderful world history phrase. Vernacular just means local language. Well, it's a challenge, as you'll see, but the Bible starts to be printed in local languages and spread by Gutenberg's printing press, which is functional by the 1450s. Now, this may seem kind of strange that the church insisted on Latin as the means of mass, and the Bible could not be printed in any language except Latin. Why does that matter? Well, to think about this, the church had pretty much complete control over your spirituality. You wanted to know what you needed to do to get right with God, to be able to get to heaven. You had one and only one way of finding out. What the priest told you was in that Bible. The fact that increasingly, as people move into the cities, as education and literacy spreads a little bit, and little by little, the Bible becomes available in German, in English, in French. How could you find out what you needed to do to be good with God? Well, you or someone you know could read it yourself. That's going to weaken the power of the church. You see these nation states arising. We're already seeing it with Spain. England, as you'll see a little bit later, starts to grow into a more powerful nation state. You certainly see France, and you see others appearing as well. Listen, there has been a long-standing battle between state and religion. If the church has all the power, that means less power for the local authorities. For the most part, in the 11th, 12th century, the local authorities, the local nations, the kings, they couldn't challenge the church. The church was too powerful. But once you start seeing bigger, wealthier, more powerful nation states, they begin to challenge the church. I would rather make the decisions I want to benefit rather than the Pope in Rome. The bubonic plague, the Black Death of the mid-14th century, I don't think you can overestimate that at all. Remember, it killed maybe a third of the European population. It meant that well, first of all, the social change, the fact that people are moving off to the cities, the populations are dying out, the fact that individual laborers, those who survive, have a lot more ability to get the kind of money that they need, to get the kind of success that they need, that they can demand more in terms of wages. That's absolutely huge. But the other question is this: what was the church able to do about the plague? And honestly, the answer is nothing. Maybe the church is not as powerful. In fact, let's go a step further. Would God have allowed this to happen if we were living the right way? Perhaps not. And if God is not happy with the way we're living, this has got to be the church's fault. Now, it's not a totally linear way of thinking like that necessarily, but there is a sense that the church is doing something wrong and certainly doesn't have the power to make things right. And with that, people start looking at the practices, the indulgences that we'll talk about soon, the suggested immorality of the church. Now, you know that one of the determining features of the Catholic churches is that the priests, the popes, would remain celibate. They would not marry, except there were priests who were known throughout Europe to have 8, 10, 12, 15 different children with 3, 4, 6 different women. You had the popes who were living in absolute luxury. You had nobles who were buying bishoprics. They were buying their way into the church, buying their way into the high position as cardinals. There were stories about popes that were doing all kinds of things with girls, with boys, you name it. And people began to question, is this really the institution of God? And by the way, suggesting more not as so much a cause as an effect, the Spanish army of Charles V, the great protector of the church, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, his soldiers march into Rome, into the Vatican City, and completely flatten it in 1527. This certainly suggests that the church is not in the same level of power that it used to be. The guy who changed history, for better or worse, he was in many ways an unpleasant fellow. He was an intense fellow, to be sure. No question that he changed the world. He came from a reasonably wealthy background. The father was a peasant, but he was educated. He was sent off to law school. Didn't quite work for him because Martin Luther, although he received the sacraments, he received the blessings of the Catholic Church, he went to Mass regularly, he was convinced that he was still going to hell. He was damned. And he lived in, people would describe this as an extreme state of anxiety, of depression. And he couldn't figure out, because he knew that deep down he was still a sinner, despite the fact that he was doing all the church told him to do, performing all the rituals. It didn't seem to be working. One day as he was looking through his Bible, of course in Latin, and as a monk he would have read Latin, he comes across the section of Romans 1, verse 17, and the key line, the righteous will live by faith. And as Martin Luther describes it, it was like a lightning bolt hit him, forced him to fall upon the ground, and he suddenly realized the full truth. We'll come back to what that truth is in just a moment, but the idea that it was faith that mattered. The rituals of the church, receiving the blessings of the priest and confession, none of that matters. It's not about your actions. It's pure on belief in God and Jesus as his Savior. That's how you live eternally. Now, supposedly 500 years ago last week, Martin Luther, on the night before All Souls Day, which of course we just celebrated last week, went to the church in Wittenberg, which is modern-day Eastern Germany, and nailed up a group of theses, of arguments, questions about the Catholic Church's behaviors. Because the next morning, of course, everybody would be coming to church for this big holiday, and they would all read these words and these arguments and discuss them. Now, realistically, they were written in Latin. Nobody, aside perhaps from the local priest, would be able to read it. It is understood today that this is a myth. It was not really pounded up. But he certainly did write these things 500 years ago in the last week. Here are the ideas that come behind them. They are long. Some of them are complicated. Most of them are dealing with very specific things about church policies. But number one, the Bible. All answers about our soul, our lives, our spirits, they are in the Bible, and they are nowhere else. Secondly, the sacraments, those rituals, everything from marriage by a priest remaining celibate, to communion, to baptism, to your last rites before you die, to confession before a priest. Basically, Luther says, well, I went through the Bible. None of it's there. The church isn't mentioned. Now, communion. I see an example of that having happened. And I also see baptism, Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist. Those two traditional sacraments, those are good things to do. We will keep them, and the church should keep them. The others simply need to be discarded. They are made up by human beings. The key one, salvation through faith. How do you get to God? How do you get to heaven? Has nothing to do with what you do day to day. Giving money to the church doesn't do anything for you. Those other rituals, aside from communion and baptism, those other sacraments, they don't do anything for you. It is simply a wholehearted, from the soul, belief in God and his mercy. End of story. Every man a priest? Well, you will determine how to do this. It is up to you. Now, you can get help from a knowledgeable person, someone who understands the Bible, somebody who can guide you. But the idea of the special level of priest, which is an intermediary between God and the common people, he disregarded that entirely. And key, and this is what really got Luther going, indulgences. As you have read, you found many priests going around, and this was established by the church as acceptable, how to raise money for the church. The church is doing a new building project. St. Peter's Cathedral is being built right now in Vatican City. Here's the deal. You would simply have a priest say to you, "Am I right, sir, that you have been living a sinful life?" "I have." "If you were to donate $50 to the church, I will give you this piece of paper and it will help get you to heaven. You will avoid purgatory for a while." These were called indulgences, and Martin Luther saw nothing like this in the Bible and began to argue, you know what's happening here? This is just greed. Also important to know, Martin Luther did not see himself creating a new form of Christianity. It was to reform the church, not to split the church. But as you'll see, within a few years, it was clear that a split was coming. It gets nasty. Johann Tetzel, who is the priest in the area, who is going around selling these indulgences, who is one of the top religious figures, once word comes out of Luther's 95 Theses, and by the way, there was more than one copy because of the printing press which existed at this point. Johann Tetzel says, "Within 3 weeks, I shall have the heretic, Luther, thrown into the fire." Now, does he literally mean thrown into fire? Yeah, he means literally thrown into the fire. Luther responds by publicly defending Jan Hus. Jan Hus was a Bohemian, a Czech theologian from the 15th century, who in fact had published the Bible in the vernacular, in the Czech language, and was burned at the stake. Luther says Jan Hus was right. The church was wrong. Well, the church, a bull is simply a statement. I know it sounds like something else, but it's not. It says, "Mr. Luther, if you do not back down, you will be excommunicated." And Mr. Luther, as a good Catholic, you know what that means. You know that you will not be able to go to heaven. You will be closed out of the church. And surely Luther will say, "My God, I have made too great a mistake." He does not. He issues a pamphlet entitled "Against the Inexorable Bull of the Antichrist." Inexorable, that means really bad. Bull is the Pope's statement. And who is Luther calling the Antichrist? The Pope himself. Ooh, boy. Martin Luther writes to Pope Leopold. Pope Leo, I guess it is. "This bull, this statement of yours, is the sum of all impiety, blasphemy, ignorance, imprudence, hypocrisy, and lying. In a word, it is Satan and his Antichrist." It's going to be really hard to back down from this. Where are the differences? Well, as mentioned, Luther argues it's not about good works. It is simply about faith. If you believe, that's all that you need. All religious authority, it's in the Bible. The church is not mentioned in the Bible. The idea of a pope, the idea of bishops, of cardinals, the many practices, the answers are in the Bible. And the church is not, as the Catholics would argue, the hierarchy, the people that lead it. It is all people. If you are a Christian believer, you are the church. You know what? Think about this for a moment. Why would the church, the Holy Roman Empire, of course, is there. It's hand in hand with the church. Why didn't they just come down on Luther? Why didn't they just send in soldiers to kill, to slaughter, to just get rid of this guy, to teach him a lesson and put an end to it entirely? Interestingly, as you have read, a lot of German princes actually joined Luther. They supported Luther. Why might they have done that? And let's think about the peasants, the vast majority. What do you think they would think of Martin Luther? Why don't you do some thinking about this, and we'll talk about this in class. I won't provide you with a list of interpretations of what happened, but maybe jot down some notes for a moment about what might be possible answers to these questions. Again, stop the film, jot down a few notes. We'll talk about it in class. Lunchtime. A diet of worms. Well, not really. It's not pronounced diet. It's diet, and diet is a meeting, a parliament, a conference, as it were. And it's not Worms, it's Worms. Worms is a city in eastern Germany where the Diet of Worms was held. And there were three people there of note. Martin Luther, come to answer for his crimes against the church. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, by the way, about 24, 25 years old at this point, and arguably the most powerful man in the world, representing the church and the Holy Roman Empire. By the way, of course, being German, Luther lived within the Holy Roman Empire. And then he, the local prince, Frederick the Wise of Saxony. Remember that the Holy Roman Empire was not a connected, strong, unified group. The local princes and kings and city-states often had their own authority. So why did the rebellion succeed? First of all, he was not the first. Luther was not the first guy to show up and say, wait a minute, the church is wrong. The Bible should be written in the local language. John Wycliffe and Jan Hus were a couple of people earlier who had said a lot of the same things and were shot down. The church was in need of reform. There's almost no question about that. It had become corrupt. You have this leftover of Renaissance era questioning, where people are questioning how the world works. You have Leonardo da Vinci suggesting that maybe human beings can fly, and people doing early scientific experiments. Well, that could move on into the church as well, the ideas of religion. The fact that Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire had a lot more to worry about than a loudmouth former priest running about in Eastern Germany. You have the Ottoman Empire, which you'll recall has recently taken Constantinople, is about to move to the gates of Vienna, and you've also got the French Empire, and France is growing as a major power, often in conflict with Charles V, i.e. Charles I of Spain. So that's all a part of it as well. You've got the idea that Luther's interests maybe appeal to the nobles' interests. After all, if the church is not all powerful, don't the local rulers become more powerful? If money in the form of indulgences and otherwise are not being sent way down to the church in Rome, perhaps the money stays in the area, to be sure. And you've also got a little bit of a sense of, wait a minute, we are people who speak a German language. We look differently, we act differently, we speak differently. Our food, our history is different than those Italians down in Rome. Remember that a state means a formalized government recognized by other people, whereas a nation is people feel a connection. There may or may not be a state going along with it. If there is, if French people culturally, a nation, form a state of France, you have a nation state. At this point, there is a German nation that is growing. The German state doesn't come along for a few hundred years. Back, by the way, to the Diet of Worms. I thought I had another slide on here. I don't. This is where Charles V shows up, and the church, in effect, says, look, Martin Luther, we're going to burn you at the stake. You are going to hell. You got to back down. And Martin Luther says, I cannot and will not recant anything that I've said. It would be unwise and unsafe to back down. Now, that's kind of a strange statement. Unsafe to say that he was wrong? I mean, he's being threatened with being burned at the stake, after all. Ask yourself for a second, we'll talk about it in class. Why would Martin Luther argue it would be unsafe? By the way, Frederick the Wise, the third guy that you saw on that slide, Frederick the Wise supported Luther, protected Luther, and dragged him away under his guard to protect him, so he could not be burned at the stake or otherwise captured by the church. Again, you can ask yourself, why was Frederick the Wise, or what might have been some of his motivations behind protecting Luther? Oh, finally, the printing press, of course, is huge. These words, 100 years earlier, and they were spoken by previous ones, John Wycliffe, Jan Hus, well, now they spread because people have a way of reading. Luther's ideas spread. John Calvin is a French-born lawyer who sets up his own version, that whereas he strongly disagrees with the Catholic Church and a lot of the ideas behind it, he sets up his own ideas. The key thing for Calvinism is the idea of predestination. The key with this is however you are born, God has already decided what's going to happen to you. Everything is written in stone. You will not live, you will not die any differently than planned. And this means, do you go to heaven or hell? You have no input, no say whatsoever. God has already determined whether you're going to heaven or hell. These are the people called the elect, the people that were expected to go to heaven. And if you were destined to be damned to hell at birth, there is nothing you can do to change it. Hey, another interesting question that you might ask yourself, maybe we'll have time to talk about in class. What would be appealing about that? How would this be a religion that spread? Because it does. Calvinism spreads to Switzerland, the Netherlands, still an important force there. Scotland, the Presbyterian Church. You see the English Puritans, the French Calvinists, a whole lot of groups of people are willing to accept this. So here is your map of Europe. You will notice, by the way, where do you notice that the Catholic Church here, kind of in pink, where does it tend to hold on to its power? You'll notice that it's primarily the southern part of Europe. Italy for sure, Spain, France to a degree, although you have all these Protestant areas here, and the further away that you move from Rome, the less Protestant countries tend, the less Catholic any of these countries tend to be. And there are some pretty clear reasons for that. England. There is a split. The Anglican Church of today, it is the Episcopal Church in the United States and other parts of the world, honestly has nothing to do with theology at all, has nothing to do with religion. Henry VIII, in fact, had been that should say Henry VIII, by the way, not Henry VII, that is a typo. Henry VIII had no problem with the Catholic Church. In fact, he had written something that was condemning Martin Luther a few years earlier, and in fact was called the great hero of the church by the Pope himself. But here's the key. Henry VIII was married and wanted a divorce. The church said, we don't do divorces. Well, Henry said, how about this? You can annul the marriage. You can pretend that it never happened. This is kind of a sneaky way to get around divorce, and the Pope refused. Henry VIII said, well, that's fine. I am then bringing England out of the Catholic Church. He sets up a new church that is called, again, the Anglican Church. I say Catholicism without the Pope. It's kind of misleading, but a lot of the rituals are there. There are bishops. Now, there are cardinals. Now, the cardinals and bishops and priests are allowed to marry, and that's a difference. But for the most part, it's similar. A lot of the rituals are there. What is the real difference? The King of England is the head of the church and not the Pope. By the way, Henry is a smart guy. Obviously, that gives him a lot of power. But rather than telling the wealthy, noble interests of England, I'm in charge of the church, I'm in charge of all, he went to the nobles, the parliament, which had been meeting since about the 13th century, and said, I have a request. I am asking you, the nobility, the parliament, represented the parliament, to allow me to be head of church. This gave Henry authority as the head of the church, which is great for Henry. It gave the nobles the power, the expressed power to be able to make this decision. One of the reasons England develops differently than the rest of Europe is the king becomes relatively less powerful over time, and the parliament assumes power. So again, we look at our map here. The farther south you go, the more Catholic you go. It's an unfortunate map because Lutheran and Catholic don't look that different here, but you can certainly make out the difference. Basically, the closer geographically we are to Rome, the more Catholic an area is going to be. The Catholic Church eventually responds. The specific details you're not going to have to know. Church councils are meetings that go on sometimes over multiple months, multiple years. This is not an 18-year meeting 5 days a week. They meet for a month, they take off for a couple of years, etc. But here's the problem. By the 1450s, 1440s, it's clear this Protestant rebellion is real. What are we, the church, going to do to keep our power, to respond to the Protestant threat? And there are some changes that are made. These indulgences. Now, they don't say that indulgences, the payment for the church, are inherently wrong. After all, The church, according to the church, is the word of God. It's the message of God. Why would people not support the church? So in fact, giving money to the church is good for your soul. That's terrific. However, it is acknowledged some of it was done out of greed, some of it was illegitimate. We're going to control the indulgences. Look, most of our priests, they're good people, they're caring people, they are men of God, but we have to acknowledge that some of the priests, some of the bishops, some of the cardinals, and even popes themselves have often been behaving immorally. That's got to stop. And we need to start educating our priests. We need to start putting more into them so they can really help the people. Bishopships, cardinal positions shouldn't be sold off to the wealthiest, to the most clueless. They should be people that really know the Word of God and can lead people. But for the most part, this Catholic Reformation, as it's often called, it reaffirmed the Catholic Church. Yes, the Bible is vital, along with the historic weight of the church. After all, the Catholics argued, Jesus went to St. Peter, the apostle, and said, Peter, you are upon the rock upon whom I shall build my church. You go to Rome and you set up my church. Well, he became the first pope, and Catholics said, absolutely, the church has an equal role along with the Bible. The seven sacraments, transubstantiation, we won't worry about. The idea is during communion, is this literally Jesus' body and flesh that appears in the wafer and the blood? It's a long, complicated argument. Bottom line is, the seven sacraments, transubstantiation, absolutely. The saints, the pilgrimage, everything, absolutely. That's a way to finding God. And the structure of the church, the idea that every man is a priest, that makes absolutely no sense. A priest is a link to God. So that's kind of the religious conflict. Leads to a political conflict. Again, that line between religious and political and economic, they're all tied together. Notice it lasts about 30 years, and it's pretty nonstop. There are brief pieces that occur, but this is pretty nasty stuff throughout Europe. Where is it fought? It's mainly in the German states. Again, no such thing as Germany, but the French get involved, the Spanish get involved, Denmark, the Habsburgs, the Swedes, the Dutch, and mercenary forces, hired soldiers. You know what? Folks looking for work. And today, I'm on this side, you're offering me more, I'm on the other side. Was it really a religious war? Well, yeah, at the beginning, it kind of was Catholic Protestant, but in the last phase of the war, it's Catholic France versus Catholic Spain and the Catholic Habsburg Empire. In other words, it seems to be, by the end of this war, more about politics, more about economic control. It is time for your SAT word of the day. This is a good one, folks. Defenestration. Defenestration. Fenes, meaning window, fenetre in France, happened at the beginning of this war in 1818. You see emissaries of the Catholic Church come to Bohemia, come to the area where Jan Hus used to make hay. This is an area where the Protestant Reformation had really taken hold. And they come and tell the local Protestants, you must come back to the church now. Well, these gentlemen were taken and literally thrown out of the third-story window. They were defenestrated. By the way, these gentlemen did not die. They landed in a huge pile of horse manure and were saved. That was the beginning of the 30 Years' War. After this war, and we won't go into the details of it, there was a peace in 1648, and it's a turning point in European history. First of all, the border rights of the major states. From this point on, the borders will change, they will move, but we have an England, we have an Austrian Empire, we have a France, we have a Spain, we have a Netherlands, we have a Switzerland. A lot, not all, but a lot of the countries that you see on modern-day European maps really exist from this point. You've also got a precedent. Nobody got everything they wanted out of this, but the idea was to maintain a balance of power. Give France enough that France won't continue fighting. Make sure the Netherlands have enough. Nobody really wins at this treaty. Everybody walks away satisfied enough. The Holy Roman Empire, which honestly had been largely powerless for many years, really is at this point powerless. It is something that's on a map. As Voltaire later said, the Holy Roman Empire isn't holy, it isn't Roman, because it doesn't even include Rome, and it sure isn't an empire. And now the idea that it is anything more than a map you've got a, quote, Germany that probably has 3, 4, 500, the numbers are still in debate, independent states. The bottom line is this: Europe is officially made up of independent nation states. Europe was Christian, identified by its religion. We are the Christian world. We are Christendom up until the 12, 13, 1400s. After the 17th century, Europe is simply not thought that way, even though a majority of the people are still Christian. And here is your new map. Again, you are recognizing major parts of modern-day Europe. Now, Italy and Germany don't actually become recognizable countries till the late 19th century, but you are starting to recognize this map of Europe. One of the real keys in all of this is the standing army, is what keeps these nation-states strong. During the 30 Years' War, there were about 1/3 French soldiers, unlike anything seen before, and you start seeing professional standing armies. This means that even in peacetime, the armies are there. Up until this period, it was far more common to say, what, we're at war? Well, I guess we'd better raise an army. Not any longer, not any longer. Now you start having nations that have round-the-clock, 365-day-a-year armies. This meant that the supply lines, when fighting far from home, we had ways of getting weapons. We had ways of getting food back and forth. Training, you've actually got like an officer corps, career officers, not simply nobles called in to lead soldiers in time of war, but young men who are trained from the ages of 13, 14, 15 to become officers. Taking care, ambulance corps, taking care of the sick, of the wounded. Interchangeable weapons. This is an industrial revolution, early industrial revolution. What this really, development, what this really means is, my gun's broken, throw it away and make a new one. It was a new way of developing, so you could say, no, the trigger is broken. We have 500 triggers ready to replace that. And also more important, remember that it was the nobles in the feudal days, in the pre-nation state days. They hired. They paid for their soldiers. They armed their soldiers. They fed their soldiers. Not any longer. Soldiers are now employees of the state, and this, of course, strengthens the nation state. Won't do quite as much with this. We can probably talk about this in class a little bit. You might think we talk about the scientific revolution, about some of the big names, about some of the developments. Probably the ones that make the most sense to know about are Copernicus and Galileo, who proved absolutely that the Earth is not the center of the universe. In fact, the Earth revolves around the sun. And we might do some talking in class about why that would be so important. The scientific revolution isn't something that happens. It's not as if people wake up one day and say, hey, what you up to today? Not much. Hey, you want to have a scientific revolution? Oh, yeah, I've been meaning to do that. Oh, wait, I gotta go somewhere with my mom. Oh, well, how about Tuesday? Yeah, Tuesday. Of course, it doesn't happen like this. What it really amounts to is people after Renaissance period, after the questioning of the Reformation, where people are questioning religion, people begin to ask even deeper questions. And you see, at least among elite and educated people, a very different way of looking at the world. All the answers are not in the Bible. Now, most of these guys remain very, they're very Christian. They devoted to the Bible. They believe in their heaven and hell, but they believe that human beings can figure out the laws that make the world go. How come? Why do you have this scientific revolution, let's say in the 16th, 17th centuries? Some of it's just the individuals. Honestly, Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, if they don't come along, maybe it doesn't happen that way. You've got the Renaissance era. And when I say rediscoveries, they had brought the ideas back of the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans. A lot of the stuff that was so revolutionary in the 17th century, folks, the Greeks had figured it out 2,000 years earlier. But the Greek learning was blocked out of Europe. It was wrong. It was pagan. It didn't mesh with the Bible, so it was forgotten. What brings it back? Well, of course, the Crusades, the fact that Muslim scholars had kept this stuff alive, comes back into Europe. Johannes Gutenberg and his printing press, well, absolutely. Exploration. There's money to be made out there. There are bigger ships to be made. There are new weapons. We need to do some research to make those weapons. Better ways. We probably won't talk about Descartes and Bacon and the other great scholars of the time, but the so-called scientific method, you have to see proof for it to count. You've also, and this is a harder argument, the Protestants of this period were more probably, especially after the initial years, more open to the idea of science than perhaps the Catholic Church. That's a bigger argument that we probably have time for. And then finally, well, so what? So what? Some of these names. So we have Gutenberg, and we have Da Vinci's ideas, and we have Bacon and Descartes, and we have Kepler and Copernicus and Newton. You know what? The vast majority of people in Europe and certainly in the world had no idea who these guys were. It absolutely didn't matter to a peasant in Russia or the Holy Roman Empire. However, there are some things that make a difference. First of all, the Age of the Enlightenment, which we're getting to later, that absolutely made a difference. It came out of the scientific revolution. Made a difference on religion. Look, with religious peoples, if the Bible isn't absolutely literally true, that opens up lines to more skepticism. Again, these early scientists, well, they were very religious people, but far less religious, or led to a less religious West that you see today. Some of the scientific knowledge goes to agriculture, producing more crops. We have the age of exploration, gets enhanced even further because there are new methods, new techniques, etc. Industry, the Industrial Revolution does not happen at this point, but some of the ideas that come from the scientific revolution absolutely do come of age during the Industrial Revolution. You start seeing the military, of course, and a lot of science. Science is a wonderful thing. It makes our lives easier. It also makes our lives a lot more destructive. So the military capacities increase. And again, the academies, academics, universities, advanced scholarship, all comes out of the scientific revolution. That's about it. I'd hoped to get this in less than an hour. It looks like I got it in 46 minutes, so you owe me. Again, I'll take a look at some notes that you took on this, the questions for discussion that you have coming in. When we come in and discuss this, I think it'll be on Monday, at least in 2017. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.